Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rehman from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about this very important developing story regarding the Iran-US tensions. Now the Middle East is already in a lot of turmoil. You talk about the northern states and countries of Africa, or you talk about Syria, you talk about Yemen, or you talk about elsewhere. There is a lot of problem, and currently when we talk about Iran, that is one of the biggest players in the Middle East and actually keeping a very decent balance with the Saudis to keep a regional balance out there. Now, recently there are threats by the Americans, none other than the Donald Trump regime, and they believe that since this P5+1, which was earlier agreed by the five major countries, including the United States of America, Russia, China, France, Britain, and Germany, when the Iranians agreed regarding the uranium enrichment and other issues, and everything was sorted out. Now, once the Donald Trump regime took power, took charge, they in fact just took a U-turn and said, well, they're not acceptable, whatever has happened earlier, and things would be renegotiated. Now, there's a lot of tension. The ships are already in the region. The Qatari bases are full of the American jets, and service has already started. Now, Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most important areas, I think, as far as sea is concerned, 80% of the total trade is to other routes, but 20% especially for this area is through, I'm talking about the oil trade, is through this area, and that is primarily for the Far Eastern countries. Now there is another sanction going to be imposed on Iran, that is about the export of oil to India maybe, and to a couple of other countries, including Russia and China. That is going to be another problem for them. They had a lot of precious metals, and earlier when this P5+1 formula was a success story, we all talked about the future of Iran's economic overall potential, and we all thought that now Iran is going to be one of the major players in the region as far as economy is concerned. They have got a lot to export, and the way Mr. Rouhani traveled all over the world and the deals they signed with Airbus and other countries, we all thought that things will be different. But now Americans, they do have a different plan in the region. And it seems that there is going to be some sort of hostility or aggression which is going to take place. And again, this entire region is going to get seized. But what sort of implication it is going to have in the long run? Obviously, one thing is about the oil prices, but at the same time, having said that, the Americans have told the OPEC producers to produce more oil, and this is what the Americans are doing at the same time to keep the prices stable. But other than that, what else could be the repercussion of that, and what sort of a fallout factor would be there, and what sort of an impact it is going to have on Pakistan and Afghanistan peace process, and for the region also. This is what we'll be talking about in our today's program. Let me introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Air Vice Marshal retired Ikramullah Bhatti Sahab, Senior Defence Analyst, sir. Thank you very much. And we have with us Begum Abida Hussain Sahiba, former ambassador, former minister, and a senior politician. Thank you very much, ma'am. And in Karachi, we'll be talking to Dr. Mooris Ahmar. He's a foreign affairs expert, and we'll also be talking to Abdullah Hassan. He's a correspondent in TRT television world. Bhatti Sahab, now Iran, if you look at the geography of Iran, the importance of the location, and the kind of oil trade route that exists right in front of there, Iran has got a decent navy. Though they are not the aggressors, Iran has never invaded any country in the recent history, sir. It is the United States of America which has got a problem with almost every single country existing peacefully in the world, sir, especially in the Middle East. Now, whatever they have done in Syria or in other countries, directly or indirectly through Saudi Arabia or other countries for that matter, look what is happening in Yemen for that matter. Now, Iran is in the line of fire. Do you see Americans' aggression on Iran in the future, sir, in the coming days or coming weeks or maybe coming months?
Well, while the Americans have deployed, they have postured their military in a manner so as to project their intention of actually undertaking some military action against Iran. But the fact remains that Iran hasn't done anything in the immediate past to deserve any such punitive action by the Americans. But at the same time, we know that in the last 5-6 years, we've seen Iran present in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and influencing Bahrain and influencing events in Yemen. And we also know that it was in last year, May, that Morocco had to break its diplomatic relations with Iran, all the way from West Africa, that Iran is supporting through Hezbollah, the separatist movements within Morocco. So Iran, when we see it, is also operating out of its league. But could it be because of the American interference in the region, because of the Israeli aggression within the region, their threats to Lebanon, their threats to Syria, and that is why Iran is doing all that in order to defend itself? But the fact remains that while JCPOA was signed, it essentially focused on the Iran's nuclear capability only. It did not take into account the Iranian missile program. It did not take into account Iran's regional expansion within the Middle East and beyond. And that is the pretext that Mr. Trump is now playing with in order to cancel that agreement with Iran, and then of course come up with this new aggressive movements against Iran.
You're cancelling the trip to Moscow and going to Brussels just to gain the support of the EU. That means a lot. I think there's something brewing in his mind.
True. You see, a European Union, while may not be very operative on the world scene, but they have major concerns vis-a-vis Iran because they are signatories to that agreement. Plus, they are major importers of Iranian oil. So any military action in the region against Iran is going to directly affect their interests. So they are an active party and they have their serious concerns, and they have already conveyed those concerns to the US. And that is one reason that Mr. Pompeo, of course, had to go back to European Union to convey the American intentions or their plans. But the fact remains that if the Americans do go about this action which they are talking about, while there are conciliatory comments at the same time, but their movement is there, their deployments have taken place, and if at all it happens, it's going to be very, very problematic, if not catastrophic, for the region.
Because, for the region?
Yes.
For the region, yeah.
Because, of course, the oil trade is the first one which is going to get hit. And then, of course, there is going to be serious geomilitary situation
so
within
you
the
talk
region.
about oil, I mean 1 million to 1.5 million barrels a day is estimated that this is the export of Iranian oil. I mean, that's huge. But ma'am, moving on to you now, first of all, region is already in a turmoil. I mean, looking at Afghanistan, looking at what is Pakistan is not stabilized so far. I mean, there are a lot of issues, a lot of problems, and economic instability is going to play a very major factor in the future also. But ma'am, another regional country, Iran, a big country for that matter. For example, the Americans, I mean, they just sort of like, you know, as the word punitive was used, punitive action. I would say any aggression, any hostility, even their presence in the region. Forget about attack on Iraq. The presence or the patrolling of Strait of Hormuz for that matter. Do you think, ma'am, that is going to be a challenge for Iran? I mean, and when you talk about sanctions, how many more sanctions? What else is America looking at? They're already in a problem. Look at what the economy is all about in Iran. And I mean, they all thought things would be different, but not at all.
I think basically the United States has to decide whether she's going to escalate further her tension with Iran or whether she's going to back off. Yesterday, Pompeo made a somewhat conciliatory statement.
Yeah.
And I think that America must be fully aware that the danger that she courts in moving physically on against Iran would be so enormous that she would not take the risk. So my thought is that the situation is likely to de-escalate.
De-escalate, and which countries do you think can play a major role in doing that? Do you think
Well,
EU is important?
Obviously, the Saudis can play a very important role.
But why should they?
And if they don't, Then there's the UAE. Pakistan can also, I think, enter the picture and play an important role.
You think so? Ma'am, but EU, I mean, you talked about EU can play, let's dissect all these three countries individually. Saudi Arabia is reg is drawn, ma'am, when it comes to Iran. So the case is UAE, I mean, all the G6 countries for that matter. Even this time, the Qatar, which was slightly different in a lot of ideologies, has offered their bases. So the US jets are there, parked everywhere now. Pakistan itself is in a problem because they are in the line of fire as well when it comes to America. EU, ma'am, EU, I was reading an article and something very interesting was written there. They said EU to America is it's like a kid who's ready to jump whenever the Americans tell them to jump. So it's not about making them jump. They always say, how high? That's the problem. It has been like that. You talk about the Iraq war, you talk about Afghanistan, you talk about any other issue, ma'am. They have always supported the Americans. It seems that things will de-escalate from this particular point because of the stakes are too high in the region. And a lot of people believe that Americans might not attempt for this misadventure because that is going to create a lot of problem for the entire region, especially in the Middle East in this part. But ma'am, let's suppose the Rouhani government, they believe and they say that, well, they will not back out whatever they are up to regarding the missile development or otherwise, uranium enrichment for that matter. If they do you expect some sort of combined effort against them from the Israelis and the Americans, ma'am? Some physical attack or something of that sort? Because this has been the history, ma'am, of the Israelis.
Much as the Israelis would want the Americans to do that, I don't think the Americans will. I think the dangers involved would be too serious.
Would be too serious.
Would be too serious.
And that is something which the Americans should not at the
And
moment.
the EU would play a very significant role.
EU can also play a very significant role. Now, sir, दूसरी चीज, the second important fact, that is about the oil attacks, I would say, orchestrated by someone to spark the conflict in that region. So many ships were shown on the television, on CNN in particular last night, with the damages. Now, what's going on out there in the region, sir? Nobody has claimed the responsibility, and you're not talking about firing from the Afghan border on our soil. You're talking about that entire region where almost, this whole region, I mean, from certain, when you talk about Strait of Hormuz, it's like around from 60 to 100 kilometers wide, depending on the areas. And almost in 3 kilometers of them, you can see the ships parked everywhere. How is it possible that something of that sort happens out there, sir? Not with one ship, but rather with so many.
Well, this is very interesting because nobody has been blamed, firstly. Secondly, nobody has claimed responsibility.
Absolutely.
And even the likely accusation could have been against Iran. Even Iranians have given a very cautious statement in which they haven't indicated any sort of entity who could have done this or any particular objective for which it could have been done. So I think it will be premature to say that it was orchestrated or it was a false flag operation, for example, because it's too it's too close and it cannot be categorized in any one category. But the fact is that it has happened, and the motive must be to I think increase the urgency of whatever is to happen and maybe provide a casus belli for whatever is to follow. But for that, they have to first of all find out the culprit as to who did it. And the way it is, nobody has been named, nobody has claimed responsibility, so whom do you go against? So that is yet to be seen and then followed up. But the fact is that here is a ready excuse available to the Americans, for example, to undertake any subsequent punitive action against whichever entity that was responsible for this action.
So wherever the Americans want to, attack, they would always create a reason for that. I mean, weapons of mass destruction in Saddam's regime, sir, for God's sake, what a lie. Eventually, Tony Blair had to say sorry to his own nation. I mean, George Bush, he's a different character altogether. Let's not talk about him. But what I'm saying is that Americans do it, destroy a country and can get away with it, sir. That's what the history tells us. They haven't fought a single war in USA. Yeah, Pearl Harbor attack, but that is also pretty interesting, I mean, story. So the case was with 9/11 on the East Coast. Now what I'm saying is, rest all the wars they have fought in other countries. I mean, according to one of the survey, during the 225 years of the American independence, or whatever you may call it, only 16 years have been without war. So you can well imagine, we call them the Afghan people that, they are happy when they're at war, and rather they're at peace when they're at war. So Americans are they're trigger happy nations. Look at what is happening out there. So you basically rule out the options over here that there could be any threat.
Yes, while this casus belli has been created, but it has not been taken up by any country. The Saudis have not blamed anyone. The Americans have not accused anyone.
Saudis recently said that there was this missile attack. I'm not sure what sort of a missile was that on Aramco. So they are also creating reasons for that. I mean, whenever there's some sort of a missile fired from Yemen, for that matter, or the border, they would end up having 1,000 sorties on the civilians. So this is what the story is all about.
Yes, they've had quite a few attacks of these surface-to-surface missiles from Yemen within Saudi Arabia. I mean, there have been attempts to hit Riyadh, for example, with those ballistic missiles. But fortunately for the Saudis, they've been able to intercept them, and no serious loss of life or property did take place. But the fact remains that the Yemenis have this capability. They continue to maintain it. They continue to use it. And but when we talk of these 4 ships getting damaged, I think for the moment they are not being used as a pretext for any further follow-up punitive military action by the Americans or anyone else in the area, not even the Saudis, for example.
What if a military vehicle, some sort of a ship is damaged out there? That could be another problem. You never know. You never know.
Certainly, that would, of course, aggravate the entire situation. And to attack a military ship, of course, the attackers would be known, discovered, identified, and immediately retaliated against. So, and that may eventually lead to some military action. But
so situation is pretty fluid. What you're
yes,
saying, I mean, everything is not
really
great.
Fluid right now. And while we can hope that it will not escalate further, as Madam is saying, but the fact remains that as long as the Americans are deployed over there, this rhetoric goes
So
on.
they have a history. Wherever they have gone, they have stayed.
So
you talk about Germany, you talk about Japan, you talk about Korea, you talk about Scandinavia, you name it, and they're there. So this is their history. Now, ma'am, another important point. Let's talk about the worst case scenario. Just in case the war is triggered, or something happens which incite the Americans to go for a war or something. Ma'am, do you think the Iranians, they have the capacity to control the Strait of Hormuz? Because last night in a television program, they said, well, they've got over 100,000 boats that can carry torpedoes and can become a huge threat. Second is the mining of the region. And then you talk about a 3-kilometer region from where the ships can pass. Now, ma'am, in that kind of a scenario, obviously there's going to be a lot of problems. A lot of issues, especially those countries which are getting the energy from Iran. And then you're talking about Qatar's LPG, sir. That also, I mean, you talk about the area, I mean, that is so sensitive, that everything passes through that. Ma'am, can that happen at some stage, that Iran has the capacity, the capability, or maybe the will at some stage to control the Strait of Hormuz?
I think that
practically
Iran would certainly control it, because it's their lifeline. If there is war and America aggresses against Iran, I think Iran's retaliation is going to be stiff and strong. And America may find that she has got more than she bargained for. So this is why, after a lot of rhetoric of tension, America has started de-escalating verbally. I think they understand that a physical episode would cost them heavily.
So you believe that initially they'll apply the pressure tactics, but as far as some sort of physical threat is concerned, you're trying to say that that is not possible for the time being.
For the time being.
For the time being. So let us go to Karachi now, and we have with us on the telephone line Dr. Mooris Ahmar sir, Foreign Affairs expert. Dr. Saab, Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Saab, first of all, thank you very much for taking out the time and talking to us in our program. Talking about the Middle Eastern crisis, especially this aggression by the Americans on Iran. So many sanctions, now they plan to impose more and possibly a physical threat as well. Now, sir, my question, because we have with us in our studio Air Vice Marshal Ikramullah Bhatti and Begum Abida Hussain Saiba, and they both believe that yes, there is a lot of tension in the region, but the physical American aggression for the time being is not possible. First of all, your take on this point, sir. And secondly, how important Strait of Hormuz would be for the other regional countries like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, for that matter, sir, and UAE in particular?
Well, I think even if we talk about long-term scenario, American military involvement in Iran is not possible because it is not like Afghanistan, it's not like Iraq, it's not like Syria. So there's a lot of difference between Iran and other countries. Now, the problem is basically, as you pointed out about the sanctions, the legitimacy of an authority, as far as the international, system is concerned, world order is concerned, it is the UN Security Council which has a right under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the UN to impose sanctions. A single country, a single member of the UN has no right to impose sanctions and then to coerce other countries that they should follow. So I think it's very unfair to create a situation in which the United States is expecting various countries, including India or many other countries who have trade relations with Iran, to comply with. So that is something which needs to be clear. And the UN is not in picture. The US has totally bypassed the UN. So this sanctions thing, it doesn't make sense. The American attack over Iran, as I said earlier, it was just like, a brinkmanship type of a situation, to create a situation. But they have forgotten the fact that Iran is not, an easy take. It's not possible. They will suck into Iran. And I don't think, and next year is the American elections, 2020. So if Donald Trump thinks, and along with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that they can play, such type of a game, they are highly mistaken. About your second, part of the question, Strait of Hormuz, certainly it's a strategic choke point. It is a very important place, the traffic of oil from the Persian Gulf countries to the rest of the world. But then we have to understand one basic thing, that the dependence of the US on the Gulf oil has substantially decreased. So is the case with other Western countries. If something happens as far as the Strait of Hormuz is concerned, and Iran is, has no option than to block the Strait of Hormuz, it will, I think, negatively impact on as far as the third world countries, developing countries are concerned, and to some extent Japan also. So the strategic importance of Hormuz is there, but it has declined in the last, say, 15, 20 years with the alternate sources of energy.
Jamal Abidi, the president of National Iranian American Council, he recently issued a statement in which he said that Bolton is basically setting up the stage for war with Iran. Now, John Bolton, we all know, I mean, former CIA and the kind of mindset he has. And he is going to deploy about 120,000 troops along with the other Air Force and naval support So that means that either they will just have that kind of number over there, sir, just to put pressure on Iran, or a physical threat is always there for the Iranians. Because if you look at the kind of engagement they had in Palestine or in Syria for that matter, the Israelis and the Saudis and all the G6 countries along with the Americans, I mean, they all supported those countries which were against Iran. So you can see there's no support for Iran in the region. Technically, I mean, it's pretty isolated, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you are right to a large extent that the isolation of Iran exists, but it doesn't mean that Iran, I mean, like Richard Pompeo, American Secretary of State, and John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. Richard Pompeo has clearly ruled out some like 120,000 American forces to be sent to Iran. What they will do is, I mean, that's my understanding, to keep up the pressure in the form of their naval warships and aircraft carrier and things like that. But Iran is used to of such type of tactics. It's nothing new. But I think it is high time that the countries of the Gulf, I mean, whether you call it Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf, whatever it is, Saudi Arabia and Iran, there's a policy when, during the Shah of Iran's time, American two-pillar policy. One pillar was Saudi Arabia, another pillar was Iran. So it has been 40 years that Iran is now anti-American. So there's only one pillar left. And there was also a time when Saudi Arabia and Iran were trying to mend their fences and improve their relations, to normalize their relations. But somehow it hasn't worked. So I think it is in the interest of Arab countries, it is in the interest of Iran to start the process of dialogue, to start the process of regional cooperation, because I think it is not Iran which is a threat to the Middle East, it is Israel. Israel is the only nuclear state in the Middle East. Israel is a country which has occupied Arab territories, has shifted its capital to Jerusalem, and it's a usurper. And what it has been doing in Gaza and elsewhere in the West Bank. Unfortunately, Arab countries, majority of the Arab countries, including the GCC countries, they are totally oblivious to this fact, and they consider Iran as a threat. So it's a misplaced type of a situation. I think it is in the interest of the Muslim countries and the Arab countries, including Iran, that they should, identify the main threat, which is Israel. And unless Israel is taken seriously in the Middle East, Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, such countries will continue to waste their resources, and the American military-industrial complex and the other arms exporting countries, they will be the beneficiaries.
Thank you very much, sir, for your comments. Now, another very important statement from none other than Mike Pompeo says US does not seek war with Iran. But having said that, they've sent their military support and all sorts of apparatus there. And at the same time, I mean, when you talk about Mike Pompeo and the Russian foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, they held talks in Russian city of Sochi. And let's see earlier, and I mean, obviously when you talk about various areas of discussion, whether you talk about Syria or you talk about other, Iran was also one of the major features in that. We'll take a short break here. After the break, we'll return and we'll continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back after the break. Ikramullah Bhatti Saab, now a couple of important statements. Mike Pompeo, on one end, says that US does not seek war with Iran. At the same time, there is a lot of planning going on in various quarters in Pentagon. And at the same time, John Bolton is issuing a different statement. The other gentleman is in Europe, Brussels, seeking support of the EU and other countries. Now, two important countries. One is China and one is India. they've got great trade ties with the Iranians. 1/3 of the oil import of the Indians are through the Iranians. And then you talk about China for that matter, another huge country, and they've got, I mean, they really want Iran to be added in the OBOR or BRI or CPEC for that matter. Now, looking at those two major factors, obviously we are witnessing this serious trade war between China and USA, but at the same time, India seems to be one country which is very close to the United States of America, and they've got their own designs for the region and everything. In this particular scenario, so do you think these two countries, along with the Russians, can practically play a very vital role, I mean, as far as diplomacy is concerned, and can diffuse the tension to a certain limit?
Well, I think the Indians have already agreed to this development whereby the Americans are going to not give any more waivers.
Don't they have a defense pact with the Iranians, sir?
Well, that defense pact wouldn't be against the Americans, for example. I think the Indians would, stay out of it, and they have agreed to this new development. I think they have reconciled, and I think it's going to be the Chinese basically who are going to be the lonely and the most, important player in, shaping up this development, and the Russians, of course, because the Chinese are going to be directly affected by this, because the Chinese are again a major importer of oil from Iran. And if the conflict does enter into a military stage, then of course the supply of oil from Iran is going to be hampered in any case, and the Americans are going to otherwise have these sanctions on the Iranian export of oil to China. And then of course it's Russia, because Russia is also a major player in this situation, and because Russia has a very good relation with Iran, and of course the Chinese are on board. So I think it is basically the Chinese who are going to influence any change or shape the American posture towards Iran. And I hope better sense prevails, because if the Americans go ahead with the design, it is still not very clear as to what is their objective, why have they deployed that aircraft carrier group, and what do they intend to achieve. At one time, while they say the ball is in Iran's court, they should start negotiations, and Mr. Pompeo says that we don't want to go to war with Iran.
Well, White House at the same time, I mean, they are also reviewing military plans against Iran, sir.
Yes, well, you see, as far as
Pompeo is saying something else, but White House is in a different state of mind, I guess.
You see, the fact remains that if they have deployed their military forces, they have moved that aircraft carrier, and they have deployed their B-52 bombers, it is essentially to project a posture, project an intention, project a capability, and of course bring about a pressure on Iran for a certain change in the behavior. Now, what is that change in the behavior that the Americans are looking forward to? That is yet to be seen, yet to be known. While the Americans were, the Iranians were willing to give up their nuclear enrichment, and they had the agreement in place, but the Americans later on came up with a new notion that that was not a right agreement, and that we need to abolish it altogether. And the only possible irritants that they had, or the aspect that they were objecting to, were the Iran's missile program and their, of course, expansion within the region. That somehow has not come up for negotiations.
Sir, if you remember, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was so vocal and was so against it. If you remember, he even went to USA and did not meet the then President Barack Obama, rather met the opposition and held a very, very, I would say, strong, sort of a conference, and he just went after the existing regime in US. Now, what my point is, sir, that this is the kind of aggression, and he was so against this P5+1 formula or this deal. They always rejected it. Don't you think, since the current equation between the American president and his family, Jared Kushner, the daughter Ivanka, and the rest of the members, that is so personal with the Israelis that, I mean, they're taking personal interest. I'll just mention three things here. For example, declaring Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, despite all odds. Then claiming the Golan Heights, which is actually a part of Syria. And then you talk about further aggression by sending these these vessels and Abraham Lincoln for that matter, that's a huge machinery I would say, right in the Gulf to put pressure on Iran, just to please certain factions, to be very honest. Future maybe anything. I mean, they could. I mean, we have also heard stories that regarding Nazbil abolishing the Aqsa Mosque for that matter. They have designs of that sort as well. So they are crossing the limit by each passing day. I mean, aggression is from their side, and all those countries who oppose that aggression are considered as aggressors, and then they are taken to task. Now, this has to end at some point, sir. Now, role of the regional players, including Saudi Arabia. And because ma'am in one of her answers in fact did mention the role of Saudi Arabia, because at the end of the day if other countries will suffer, they will also suffer, no matter how close they are to the Americans. Sir.
You see, first of all,
but they are looked upon as the ATM cards for the Americans, honestly speaking.
You see, the Iranians do have the capacity and the capability to hit back on the American interests within the region. Should the situation turn into a military situation. And while the Americans may not get hurt, they may not lose lives. It is Saudi Arabia, it is UAE, and it is the other countries in the region which are going to get hurt, wherever the American interests are located in terms of their physical assets, their soldiers or their aircraft or their other weapon and ammunition depots, including Israel. So, the Americans may not lose anything, but the fact remains that these countries will be subjected to Iranian retaliation, and they are the ones who are going to lose lives and property. So, of course, while Saudi Arabia may be feeling comfortable that Iran is coming under pressure, the fact remains that should this turn into a military exchange, Saudi Arabia is going to get hurt, UAE is going to get hurt. And
G6 countries, I mean, even Pakistan is going to face the impact.
Yes, because we will be put in a situation where we will have to take a side, which will be
at some stage you will have to.
It will be extremely difficult for us, because Iran is our neighbor, and on the other side we have Saudi Arabia, who is a very good friend, and then we have the Americans who are present right next door in Afghanistan. So
and will be present right next door in the Strait of Hormuz also.
Yes.
So that is going to be a problem.
Not just Pakistan, other countries are going to be put in a very tight corner. The Turks are going to be in a tight situation, and other countries in the region, and of course China and Russia will have to take a decision as to how they go about react to this.
Well, let's see, sir. Since you talked about Turkey, we have our Abdullah Hassan Saab, is correspondent of TRT World. Hassan Abdullah Saab, thank you very much for taking out your time and talking to us. First of all, sir, what's the latest which you have to share with us? What's brewing out there? What exactly is being discussed in the Turkish corridors of power, sir?
Well, thank you for having me. As far as the Turkish position is concerned, the Turkish Foreign Ministry said that any sort of escalation will not be conducive for the entire region and beyond. And also the Turkish side is saying it's important that the United States in particular abides by the sort of rules-based international system and avoids this kind of warmongering. But obviously the statements that are coming, at least officially, from the top levels in Tehran as well as in Washington do suggest that perhaps there is some sort of an attempt to de-escalate this. But I think it's important to understand the dynamics of the lobbies operating in Washington, especially the warmongers, who it seems are quite keen to push for a confrontation.
The Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif says his country anticipated activities to escalate tension by the hardliners in the US and the Middle East. What would you say about that?
I think that's true. I mean, as I mentioned, there are warmongers in Washington. For example, if you look at people like John Bolton, who have been quite unapologetic despite the clear American failures in Iraq, and they've been saying that they have no regrets. And this is the sort of the neoconservative and the liberal internationalist lobby in Washington that's pushing for a confrontation with Iran. There are stakes, there are sort of gains at stake, perhaps material gains for some of these companies, some of these individuals with links to certain companies, certain American companies, and also certain other offshore companies. So, that's an economic factor we cannot take out of the equation. But if you're looking at the U.S. president himself, for example, it's quite interesting because he did say during his election campaigning that he's going to keep the United States out of what he called useless and not a never-ending wars, and he had said that he was going to have a more sort of a domestic focus. So perhaps he may have a desire to stick to those campaign promises, especially with elections just around the corner. But at the same time, sometimes a bit of saber rattling can be good to provide some relief if you're facing domestic pressures, if your economy is in trouble. I mean, that's certainly the case for Iran, where the country is facing economic troubles, and perhaps a bit of escalation can be good to sort of rally people around the flag, and to an extent that could work in Washington as well. But escalation, I think it's quite understood, at least within the sensible sectors of all the countries, that it's not going to be in anyone's interest.
Ma'am, last question to you. Now, there's something pretty interesting to talk about. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei said on Tuesday that there would be no war with the United States of America despite all the mounting concerns. Then he also said that Iran would not negotiate with the US on the new nuclear deal. No negotiations on the new nuclear deal. Old has been abolished by the Americans. They are aggressors. They have brought in their vehicles, vessels, and all sorts of equipment to put more pressure on Iran. And where will it lead if there is no compromise made by the Americans and there is no flexibility shown by the Iranians?
Well, as Ayatollah Khamenei has said, there will be no war. Therefore, both countries will inevitably, perhaps through a third party, if not bilaterally, enter into some sort of policy which is a live and let live, which both countries can find mutually acceptable. But the hostilities are likely to de-escalate in the foreseeable future.
Right.
And my personal opinion is that they will find a common interlocutor who will help both countries to find a formula that is mutually acceptable.
All right. All right. So let's hope and pray things do get better, because even during this holy month, the Taliban are also pretty, they're acting pretty naive and differently. Otherwise, we all know what's been happening in the Arab Spring. But anyway, Ikramullah Bhatti Saab, ma'am, it was a pleasure, and thank you so much for watching the show. I'll see you again tomorrow at 8. Take good care of yourself. Good afternoon from our side.